I thought the week before my wedding would feel loud and bright. It felt busy instead. I laughed with my friends while we argued about playlists. I told vendors, yes, that works, and no, move it earlier. I kept saying, Emily will love that. I believed the future was locked, like a door already closed. My phone rang while I was measuring the table space at the venue. I smiled when I saw her name. Hey, I said. I'm standing where we'll cut the cake. Can we meet? Emily asked. Now? I laughed. What's wrong? Please, she said. Her voice was flat. I need to see you. Okay, I said, and my smile faded. Where? By the River Cafe, she replied. 10 minutes. I drove too fast. I told myself she was nervous. I practiced jokes at red lights. When I arrived, she was already there, hands folded, eyes on the water. Hey, I said, leaning in. She didn't move. We need to talk, she said. We always talk, I said. You're scaring me, she inhaled. I'm canceling the wedding, I stared at her. What? I found clarity, she said, like she'd rehearsed it. I can't do this. I laughed once. This isn't funny. I'm serious, she said. I'm choosing someone else. My chest tightened. Someone else? Ryan, she said. He came back. It made me see things. See what? I asked. That I'm not enough? She looked away. This isn't about you. It's only about me, I said. It's my life. I don't want to argue, she said. I've decided. You decided? I said. Together. We decide together. I'm sorry, she said. Please understand. Understand what? I asked. That you're walking out a week before our wedding? He offers stability, she said. A future. We had a future, I said. We planned it. She shook her head. Plans aren't promises, I felt small. Tell me I did something, I said. Give me a reason. There isn't one, she said. I just know. You just know? I repeated. After 5 years? She stood. I won't change my mind. I reached for her hand. She pulled back. Don't, she said. Emily, I said, my voice breaking. Please. She paused. I hope you'll be okay. She left. I stayed. The river moved like nothing had happened. My phone buzzed with vendor emails. I read none of them. My phone rang again. It was my best friend. How's it going? He asked. It's over, I said. What do you mean over? He asked. She canceled, I said. For another man. There was a long silence. Where are you? He asked. By the river, I said. Where we were supposed to take pictures. I'm coming, he said. I watched couples pass. I heard laughter. I whispered, this can't be real, like the words might fix it. I called Emily. She didn't answer. I texted, talk to me. No reply. A waitress asked, anything to drink? I said, water. My hand shook when I lifted it. My friend arrived and said my name. I stood and nearly fell. I don't know who I am, I said. He said, sit. I sat. I feel stupid, I said. I trusted her. He said, you loved her. I still do, I said, then hated myself for it. We didn't say much after that. The sun dipped. The water darkened. I stood there, alone, realizing my life hadn't cracked. It had collapsed. I'd breathed once, then again, and promised myself I would survive tonight, even if tomorrow arrived empty, silent, and cruel, without answers or mercy or hope left. The days after the cancellation didn't feel like days at all. They felt like pauses where time forgot to move, and I kept replaying everything in my head, asking myself where I failed, what I missed, and why love could vanish without warning. And when Mark finally came over, he didn't start with comfort but with truth, saying, I talked to someone who knows Ryan. And I asked, why are you saying his name like it matters? And Mark replied, because this didn't start last week. And I felt my stomach drop as I said, what do you mean? And he sighed, then said, he came back months ago, man. And I laughed bitterly, asking, so I was just filler? And Mark didn't answer right away, which hurt more than words. And when he finally said, he promised her things you couldn't, I snapped, money. And Mark nodded, adding, status, travel, security. And I said, so love wasn't enough. And Mark said softly, it never is when someone's afraid. And that night, alone, I opened my phone and searched her name even though I knew better. And there it was, an engagement post with a ring bigger than our future ever was. And my chest tightened as I whispered, already? And I scrolled through comments full of fake happiness and congratulations, feeling like a sentence erased from a story that kept going without me. And I texted Mark, "She replaced me like it was nothing," and he replied, "She didn't replace you, she traded up in her mind." And that word traded burned, because I realized I wasn't a person to her anymore, I was a version she outgrew. And the next morning Emily finally messaged me saying, "I hope you can understand," and I stared at that word, understand, like it was a knife, and I typed, "Understand what?" But deleted it, then typed, "You planned a wedding with me." Deleted that too, then finally replied, "I understand," even though I didn't, and when Mark called later and asked, "You okay?" I laughed and said, "I'm fine," and he said, "Don't lie to me," and I admitted, "I feel stupid," and he said, "You trusted someone," and I replied, "Who was already gone," and there was silence again, the kind that lets thoughts grow louder. And I realized my sadness was changing shape, turning from grief into something colder, something sharper, not revenge, not yet, but awareness, the kind that wakes you up in the middle of the night and says, "Never again." And when Mark said, "What are you going to do now?" I answered honestly, "I don't know." But inside I felt it, a quiet hardening, like wet cement finally setting. And for the first time since she left, I didn't imagine winning her back or begging for answers. I imagined surviving without explaining myself to anyone, especially her, and as I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling, I thought, if she rewrote her life without me, then I'll rewrite mine without asking permission. And that thought didn't make me happy. But it made me steady, and steadiness felt like the first step towards something dangerous. Something new, something I wasn't ready to name yet, but knew would change everything. The invitation arrived in my inbox like a quiet insult, clean and polite, announcing that Emily was marrying Ryan in 6 weeks. And I stared at the screen until Mark said, "You look like you're about to throw your phone," and I replied, "She invited the world to watch her erase me," and he said, "You don't have to go." But I asked, if I don't go, does that make me weak? And Laura called that night and said, "I heard," and I said, "You always do," and she replied, "Because you don't hide pain well." And when I forwarded her the invitation, she went silent, then said, "That's cruel," and I asked, "Should I disappear?" And Mark said, "You could," while Laura said, "You shouldn't," and I argued with both of them, saying, "If I go, I humiliate myself." And Laura said, "Only if you let them define you," and Mark added, "If you don't go, you'll wonder forever." And that night Emily called me, not softly, not sadly, but carefully, and said, "I just wanted to ask something," and I said, "You already took everything else." And she replied, "Please don't cause drama if you come," and I laughed once and said, "Drama?" And she said, "I want the day to be peaceful." And I answered, "You mean convenient," and she snapped, "That's not fair," and I said, "Neither was canceling our wedding." And she paused, then said, "I hope you understand." And that word hit me again, understand, and I realized she didn't regret hurting me. She regretted disruption, and I said calmly, "I won't ruin your day." And she said, "Thank you," like I'd done her a favor. And when the call ended, Laura asked, "Do you still love her?" And I said, "Not the woman she is now." And Mark asked, "So what will you do?" And I looked at the invitation again and said, "I won't vanish." And Laura said, "That's my brother." And Mark said, "You don't need a plan yet." And I replied, "I just need my spine." And over the next days, people messaged me with pity disguised as concern, asking, "Are you okay?" And I replied, "I'm alive." And that was true, but barely, and every time doubt crept in, I remembered her voice asking for convenience instead of forgiveness. And something firm settled in my chest, not anger, not revenge, but resolve. And when Mark asked, "What if it hurts to go?" I said, "It will hurt more to hide." And when Laura said, "You don't owe her anything," I said, "I owe myself a moment where I don't look away." And as the 6 weeks began to shrink, I stopped imagining her walking down the aisle and started imagining myself standing upright somewhere in that room. Not begging, not broken, just present. And for the first time since she left, I felt a strange calm, because even without knowing how, I knew one thing clearly: I would not be the silent ghost in a story that rewrote my ending without my consent. The coffee shop smelled like burned beans and quiet mornings, and I almost turned around when I saw Sophia at the corner table. Because I didn't want pity, but she smiled and said, "You look tired." And I said, "I feel hollow." And she replied, "Sit." Like it wasn't a question, and when I did, she asked, "Tell me what happened." And I said, "My wedding ended before it began." And she didn't gasp or say sorry, she just nodded and said, "Start from where it hurt most." So I told her everything. How Emily left, how I felt replaced, how every day felt smaller, and Sophia listened without interrupting until I finally said, I don't know what I did wrong, and she leaned forward and asked, why does it have to be wrong? And that stopped me. And I said, because someone leaves only when something fails. And she shook her head and said, sometimes people leave because staying would expose who they really are. And I laughed weakly and said, that doesn't help. And she answered, it's not meant to comfort you. And then she asked the question that stayed with me. What if this ending is your beginning? And I stared at my cup and said, beginnings aren't supposed to hurt like this. And she replied, neither are lies. But they do. And for the first time I felt seen, not fixed, just understood. And when she shared her own story about trusting someone who chose safety over truth, I said, so you survived. And she smiled slightly and said, I changed. And that word echoed. And when I stood to leave, she said, don't rush to erase pain. And I said, I don't know who I am without her. And she answered, then find out. And she asked, will you let pain define you? And I said, I don't know how to stop it. And she replied, you don't stop it, you listen. And I said, it keeps telling me I wasn't chosen. And she answered, no. It's telling you that you were spared. And I frowned and said, that sounds like something people say after. And she said, exactly. And when I asked, after what? She replied, after they survive. And that word followed me as I talked, as I admitted how I checked my phone every morning, how I waited for apologies that never came. And she said, you're still asking her to define your worth. And I whispered, I don't know how to stop. And she said, start by asking a better question. And I asked, like what? And she said, who do you want to be when this no longer hurts? And I couldn't answer, not because I didn't care, but because no one had asked me that before. And when silence stretched, she said, you don't need to impress anyone today. And I nodded, feeling something loosen. And as we stood, she said, whatever you choose next, choose it because it's true. And I said, thank you for not lying to me. And she replied, truth is lighter than comfort. And as I stepped outside, I realized the ache was still there, but it had shifted, like a weight moved from my chest to my hands. Something I could finally carry forward. I breathed, knowing the story hadn't fixed me. But it had turned me toward myself for the first time, and that felt like the beginning, even if I was still afraid to admit it out loud. I walked away thinking less about her choices and more about my own unanswered future. It wasn't hope yet, but it was movement, and movement felt enough for now, so I kept walking into whatever came next. The idea didn't arrive like a plan. It slipped in like a joke when Mark said, you know what would really mess with them? And I said, I'm not in the mood. And he replied, show up happy. And I laughed and said, that's impossible. And he shrugged and said, then fake it. And later when I told Sophia about it, she tilted her head and asked, why stop there? And I frowned and said, stop where? And she stirred her coffee and said, what if you didn't arrive alone? And I said, I wouldn't do that. But my heart reacted before my mouth, and I added, that would be insane. And she looked at me and said, insane isn't always wrong. And I felt heat rush to my face as I said, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. And she replied calmly, then don't. And I asked, what are you suggesting? And she said, I'm asking a question. And I said, married? And she didn't smile. She just said, why does that scare you more than being humiliated? And I snapped, because it would be using you. And she leaned back and said, then don't use me. And silence sat between us until I said, I don't even know if I believe in marriage anymore. And she answered, neither did I until I believed in choice. And I said, this feels like revenge. And she shook her head and said, revenge is about them. This would be about you. And I asked, how? And she said, because you'd be deciding how you show up to your own pain. And I rubbed my face and said, I don't want to become someone petty. And she replied, then be honest. And I asked, honest about what? And she said, about why you do it. And I whispered, I don't want to be the man she erased. And Sophia nodded and said, that's not revenge, that's dignity. And Mark later called and said, you okay? And I said, I'm thinking dangerous thoughts. And he laughed and said, finally. And I snapped, this isn't funny. And he replied, it's serious because you care. And I said, what if I regret it? And he said, you already regret disappearing. And when I told Sophia that, she said, I won't pretend. And I said, I wouldn't ask you to. And she added, and I won't lie, and I replied, I don't want to lie. And she said, then understand this. And I listened as she said, if we do this, it's not a show. It's a choice we both benefit from. And I asked, benefit how? And she said, you reclaim yourself, and I stop waiting for permission to live boldly. And I said, this could change everything. And she replied, so could doing nothing. And my chest felt tight as I said, I'm scared. And she said, good, that means it matters. And I looked at her and realized she wasn't offering escape. She was offering agency, and that scared me more than Emily ever did. And when I asked, are you serious? She answered, only if you are. And I finally said the words out loud, what if we arrive married? And she held my gaze and said, then we do it with respect, truth, and no apologies. And I felt the weight of it settle, heavy and irreversible. And after a long breath, I said, I won't hide anymore. And she nodded once. And in that moment, I knew the decision wasn't about the wedding. It was about choosing not to disappear. And that choice, once made, changed everything I thought I was capable of becoming. The courthouse was quiet in a way that felt honest, and as Mark whispered, this is really happening, I nodded and said, I know, while Laura squeezed my hand and asked, are you sure? And I answered, for the first time in weeks, yes. And when Sophia looked at me and said, we can still walk away, I replied, I don't want to. And the clerk cleared her throat and said, please step forward. And I noticed how calm my hands were, not shaking like they did when I stood beside Emily at tastings and fittings. And Sophia said softly, no pretending. And I said, no pretending. And when the clerk asked, do you take each other willingly? I said, I choose this. And Sophia said, I choose this too. And Mark smiled and whispered, damn. And Laura wiped her eyes and said, I've never seen you this steady. And as the words were spoken, I didn't feel fireworks or victory. I felt alignment, like my spine finally straightened. And when the clerk said, you may kiss, Sophia laughed quietly and said, keep it simple. And I nodded and said, always. And afterward Mark said, you look different. And I asked, better? And he replied, real. And Laura hugged me and said, she didn't deserve the man you are now. And I answered, this isn't about her. And Sophia heard that and said, good. And as we walked outside, I realized I wasn't scanning the street for judgment or witnesses. Because this wasn't a performance, it was a decision, and that difference mattered more than ceremony ever could. And when Mark asked, are you going to tell people? I shook my head and said, no announcements. And Laura said, let them wonder. And Sophia added, silence travels faster than explanations. And that felt right. Because in my old life I explained everything, defended everything, proved everything, and here there was nothing to prove. And as we sat in the car, Mark joked, you know this changes the game. And I said, I'm not playing anymore. And Sophia looked at me and said, how do you feel? And I searched myself and said, grounded. And she smiled and replied, that's stronger than happy. And on the drive home I thought about how my last relationship always felt like walking on a stage. Always adjusting, always afraid of applause stopping, and this felt like standing on solid ground with no audience. And when my phone buzzed with a message preview from someone asking, are you okay? I turned it face down and said, I'm done answering that. And Sophia said, good. And I realized that nothing in my chest was racing, nothing was chasing approval or revenge. And that scared me in a new way because calm felt unfamiliar, and when Mark said, you know she'll find out, I answered, she can. And Laura said, and when she does? And I said, I'll still be here. And Sophia reached for my hand and said, that's the point. And in that moment, I understood the shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and irreversible because I had chosen myself without announcing it, without proving it, without asking permission. And as we stepped out into the ordinary afternoon, I realized the strongest moves don't arrive with noise. They arrive with certainty, and that certainty settled in me like something permanent. Something earned. Something that didn't need witnesses to be real. And as I breathed in the air and let the silence stretch, I knew the balance had already changed. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer needed to be seen to exist. And that was power, the kind that starts quietly and never asks for attention again. The venue was louder than I expected, all laughter and music and glasses clinking, and the moment I stepped inside with Sophia beside me, the noise dipped just enough for me to feel it. The pause, the whispers, the sudden awareness, and Mark leaned in from somewhere behind and muttered, yeah, they see you. And I said quietly, Let them, while Sophia squeezed my hand and asked, You okay? And I replied, I've never been steadier. And that was true because when Emily turned and saw me, her smile froze. Not slowly but sharply, like it had been yanked away. And for a second she forgot where she was, forgot who she was supposed to be, and I saw it in her eyes before she caught herself. And Ryan followed her gaze and looked at me like he was solving the problem he didn't expect, and he stepped forward and said, Didn't know you were coming, and I answered, Things change. And Sophia smiled politely and said, Congratulations, and Ryan hesitated before replying, Thank you, like the word tasted wrong. And Emily recovered enough to walk over and say, Can I talk to you? And I looked at Sophia and she said, I'll be right here. And Emily pulled me aside and whispered, What is this? And I asked calmly, Your wedding? And she snapped, Don't play games. And I said, I'm not. And she looked past me at Sophia and said, You brought someone. And I replied, I came with my wife. And her breath caught and she said, That's not funny. And I answered, I'm not joking. And she searched my face and said, When? And I said, Recently. And she shook her head and said, You did this to hurt me. And I said, I didn't do this for you. And that landed harder than anger. And she said, You couldn't wait. And I replied, I waited long enough. And her voice dropped as she said, You're trying to ruin my day. And I answered, I'm not doing anything but standing here. And she laughed under her breath and said, You always had to prove something. And I said, I finally stopped. And she stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Because she didn't. And Ryan interrupted with a stiff smile and said, Everything okay? And Emily said too quickly, Yes. And I said, Perfect. And Ryan looked between us and said, Well, enjoy the evening. And I replied, We will. And as we walked back, Sophia whispered, You didn't raise your voice once. And I said, I didn't need to. And guests smiled at us with confusion layered under politeness. And someone said, Good to see you. And I replied, Good to be here. And Emily watched from across the room, her calm unraveling in small ways, a missed step, a forced laugh. And when the music swelled and Ryan went to greet more guests, Emily appeared again and said quietly, Do you hate me? And I looked at her and said, No. And she flinched like she wanted that answer to be different. And she said, Then why are you here? And I said, Because I didn't want to hide. And she asked, From me? And I replied, From who I became after you left. And her eyes softened and she said, I never meant to hurt you. And I said, Intent doesn't change impact. And she whispered, I made a mistake. And I shook my head and said, You made a choice. And she said, Is there anything left between us? And I answered honestly, No. And that word broke whatever hope she had been holding. And as I walked back to Sophia, I felt eyes on my back. But they didn't weigh on me anymore because the balance had shifted without noise or spectacle. And when Sophia asked, Are you ready to go? I said, In a moment. And as I stood there, calm in a room built on my past, I realized the power wasn't in arriving with her, it was in arriving unchanged by them. And when Emily finally looked away first, I knew something irreversible had happened. Not to her wedding, but to the story she thought she was still writing about me. As the ceremony moved forward, I stopped watching the decorations and started watching people, because that's where the truth leaked out, and Mark leaned in and whispered, She's nervous. And I said, She always is when control slips. And Sophia murmured, Ryan looks proud of himself. And I replied, Pride cracks first. And as we stood near the back, a man I barely recognized nodded at me and said quietly, Didn't expect to see you? And I answered, Life's unpredictable. And he smirked and said, Especially business. And I asked, What do you mean? And he shrugged and said, Ryan's company's been bleeding. And before I could ask more, he added, Careful who you marry. And walked away, and Sophia looked at me and said, That explains the tension. And I said, She traded certainty for shine. And nearby I heard whispers, Did you see her face? And something's off. And when Ryan laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, Sophia whispered, That's insecurity pretending to be confidence. And I nodded because I recognized the performance. And when Emily approached again, her smile was tight and her voice sharper than before as she said, You're enjoying this. And I asked, Enjoying what? And she said, Watching me unravel. And I answered, I'm just attending. And she said, You knew this would mess with me. And I replied, I knew I wouldn't hide. And she crossed her arms and said, You always needed to make a point. And I said, I stopped making points when I stopped begging. And she laughed nervously and said, "You think you won?" And I answered, "This isn't a competition." And she said, "Then why are you here?" And I looked at her and said the truth. "I didn't come to hurt you. I came because I'm no longer broken." And her face changed, not with anger, but with something closer to grief. And she whispered, "You're lying." And I shook my head and said, "I finally stopped." And she said, "You don't get to be okay this fast." And I replied, "Time doesn't heal, choices do." And she glanced at Sophia and said, "So this is real?" And I answered, "Real enough to stand quietly." And her voice cracked as she said, "I gave up everything for this." And I asked, "Did you give it up or did you trade it?" And she snapped, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "I know you thought safety was louder than truth." And she looked away and said, "Ryan gives me a future." And I replied, "I gave you one too." And she whispered, "Not like this." And I said, "Exactly." And a bridesmaid appeared and said, "They need you." And Emily hesitated, then looked back at me and said, "You're doing this on purpose." And I answered calmly, "I'm doing nothing." And she said, "You always wanted to be the good guy." And I replied, "I just wanted to be myself." And when she walked away, her steps were unsteady, and Sophia exhaled and said, "That hurt her." And I said, "Truth usually does." And Mark joined us and said, "Word spreading." And I asked, "About what?" And he said, "That Ryan's money isn't as solid as it looks." And I watched Ryan glance at his phone, jaw tightening, laughter fading, and Sophia whispered, "You didn't plan any of this." And I said, "No." And she replied, "That's why it's working." And as the music rose again and the smiles returned like masks, I felt no satisfaction, only clarity, because the cracks weren't mine anymore, they were theirs. And for the first time, I understood that strength doesn't announce itself. It stands still while everything else shakes. And as Emily walked past me one last time without meeting my eyes, I knew the line I spoke hadn't wounded her pride. It had shattered the story she told herself about why she left. And that truth would follow her long after the dress came off and the lights went out. Days after the wedding, my phone lit up with Emily's name, and I stared at it until Sophia asked, "Are you going to answer?" And I said, "I don't know." And she replied, "Then answer honestly." So I did. And Emily's voice sounded smaller as she said, "I didn't think you'd pick up." And I answered, "You called." And she paused before saying, "I'm sorry." And I said, "That's new." And she whispered, "I know." Then added, "I made a mistake." And I leaned back and asked, "What kind?" And she said, "I thought I chose safety." And I replied, "And?" And she exhaled and said, "Ryan isn't who I thought." And I said, "People rarely are." And she rushed on, saying, "His business is falling apart. He's angry all the time. Everything feels unstable." And I asked, "Why are you telling me this?" And she hesitated before saying, "Because I keep thinking about what you said." And I replied, "I said a lot of things." And she said, "About not being broken." And that landed quietly, and she added, "You were right." And I closed my eyes and said, "Right about what?" And she said, "About me choosing wrong." And I felt something tug in my chest, not hope, not love, just memory. And she whispered, "Is there anything left between us?" And the room went still, and Sophia didn't speak. She just watched me with trust instead of fear, and I said slowly, "Why are you asking now?" And Emily said, "Because I'm scared." And I replied, "You were scared before too." And she said, "I didn't know." And I answered, "You chose not to." And she cried softly and said, "I gave up everything." And I said, "You didn't lose me, you let go." And she asked, "Do you ever think about us?" And I said, "I remember us." And she said, "And?" And I answered, "I don't live there anymore." And she went quiet and said, "I thought you'd fight for me." And I replied, "I did." And she whispered, "Then why won't you now?" And I said, "Because now I know the cost." And she said, "I can fix this." And I asked, "Fix what?" And she said, "Us." And I shook my head even though she couldn't see it and said, "There is no us." And she said, "You sound cold." And I replied, "I sound healed." And she snapped, "You moved on too fast." And I said, "You moved on first." And she fell silent again, then said, "I thought you were my safe place." And I answered, "I was, until you decided safety meant someone else." And she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." And I replied, "Meaning doesn't erase damage." And she asked, "So that's it?" And I said, "That's the truth. and she said, "You don't even miss me?" And I said, "I miss who I was when I trusted you," and that broke something in her. Because she cried openly then and said, "I wish I could go back." And I answered, "So did I." And she asked, "Can you forgive me?" And I said, "I already did." And she whispered, "Then why won't you come back?" And I replied, "Because forgiveness isn't a doorway." And she said, "You loved me." And I answered, "I loved who you were before the choice." And she said, "I'm still here." And I said, "I'm not." And the line went quiet except for her breathing, and finally she said, "I understand." And I almost laughed at that word, but instead I said, "I hope you do." And when the call ended, Sophia asked, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I chose myself." And she smiled and said, "That's the hardest door to keep closed." And as I set my phone down, I felt no triumph, only relief, because the past had knocked loudly, but I hadn't opened it. And in that silence I understood that self-respect isn't dramatic. It's quiet, firm, and final, and that choosing it meant the story behind me could finally stop calling my name. The news reached me in fragments, not headlines, the way truth usually does, when Mark texted, "Have you seen this?" And I replied, "Seen what?" And he sent a link and said, "Ryan's company is under investigation." And I read it once. Then again, and Sophia watched me and asked, "How does that make you feel?" And I said, "Nothing." And she raised an eyebrow and said, "Nothing at all?" And I thought for a second and answered, relieved that I don't care. And later Laura called and said, "People are talking." And I asked, "About what?" And she replied, "About lawsuits, unpaid salaries, bad deals." And I said, "That escalated fast." And she said, "It was always there." And over the next days the whispers grew louder, friends forwarding screenshots, acquaintances asking questions they pretended weren't questions, and someone messaged me, "Guess karma's real." And I didn't reply because celebration felt cheap, and when Sophia asked, "Do you want him to fall?" I said, "I want to stay standing," and she smiled and said, "That's different." And Emily's name appeared again. Not in messages to me, but in gossip, people saying she'd sold her car, that she'd moved apartments, that she looked exhausted. And Mark said, "She's stuck cleaning up his mess," and I replied, "She chose the partnership." And he said, "You're colder than before." And I answered, "I'm clearer." And one night, Sophia and I sat quietly and she asked, "Do you ever wish you'd pushed harder?" And I said, "For revenge?" And she nodded, and I shook my head and said, "Revenge would have kept me tied to him." And she said, "And now?" And I replied, "Now I'm free." And she leaned against me and said, "That's growth." And the strangest part was how public it all became. Ryan's confidence replaced by silence, invitations drying up, smiles turning cautious, and Emily photographed beside him with eyes that no longer sparkled. And Sophia said softly, "You see it, don't you?" And I said, "The cost?" And she replied, "The weight of the choice." And I nodded. Because I remembered how heavy it felt to carry someone else's fear. And when Mark joked, "You won without lifting a finger," I said, "I didn't win." And he said, "Sure looks like it." And I answered, "I just stopped losing." And one afternoon I ran into someone who knew Ryan and he said, "You dodged a bullet." And I replied, "I stopped standing in the line of fire." And he laughed, but I meant it, because watching the collapse from a distance felt different than imagining it, quieter, sadder. And when Sophia asked, "Do you feel sorry for her?" I paused and said, "I feel detached." And she said, "That's mercy without sacrifice." And as the weeks passed, Ryan's name became shorthand for failure, and Emily's smile became brittle. And people stopped asking me how I felt because the answer no longer fed their curiosity. And when Sophia finally said, "Karma didn't need your help," I smiled and replied, "It never does." And I realized then that the strongest choice I made wasn't showing up to the wedding, or marrying quietly, or refusing to go back. It was stepping aside and letting consequences walk their own path. Because revenge demands energy, but growth demands distance. And as I watched the storm pass without touching me, I understood that karma doesn't knock to ask permission. It arrives when it's ready, and the best thing I ever did was make sure it found me already gone. Life slowed down in a way I didn't expect, not dull but steady, and one morning Sophia asked, "Do you miss the chaos?" And I smiled and said, "I didn't know peace could feel this full." And she laughed and replied, "That's because you confused intensity with meaning." And as we sat at the table planning ordinary things like groceries and weekends, I realized how different this felt from my old life, where every conversation felt like a test. And when I came home tired from work and said, "I think I finally did something right today," She answered, "You do that a lot now." And I said, "I used to need approval." And she replied, "Now you need alignment." And that word stayed with me because alignment meant my thoughts matched my actions. And when Mark visited and joked, "You're boring now," I said, "I'm stable." And he nodded and said, "I've never seen you like this." And later, Law recalled and said, "You sound lighter." And I replied, "I stopped carrying things that weren't mine." And Sophia overheard and said, "That's growth." And I felt it too in small moments, like when my phone buzzed with old memories and I didn't flinch, or when someone mentioned Emily's name. And it landed like a fact instead of a bruise. And one evening, Sophia asked, "Do you ever think about what could have been?" And I thought for a moment and said, "I think about what almost wasn't." And she smiled and said, "That's a better question." And we talked about the future without urgency, without fear, just choices. And I realized I wasn't reacting anymore, not to gossip, not to regret, not to the past knocking softly out of habit. And when Sophia said, "You're different when you talk about tomorrow," I asked, "How?" And she replied, "You don't sound like you're running." And that was true because before I ran toward love, ran away from conflict, ran after validation, and now I walked, and that pace changed everything. And when work challenges came up and I said, "I'll handle it," I meant it without proving it. And when Sophia said, "You don't need to be strong all the time," I answered, "I know," and meant that too. And one afternoon Mark asked, "Do you ever feel tempted to check in on her?" And I said, "No," and he raised an eyebrow and said, "Really?" And I replied, "I don't need reminders to know who I am now." And later that night, Sophia said, "She became a lesson, didn't she?" And I nodded and said, "Not a scar, just a marker." And she said, "For what?" And I answered, "For the point where I stopped abandoning myself." And that truth settled deep. Because I understood that I didn't lose a future, I lost a version of myself that kept shrinking to be chosen. And when Sophia rested her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm glad you didn't disappear," I said, "So am I." And as the days stacked quietly into weeks, I realized the life I almost missed wasn't dramatic or loud. It was consistent, honest, and calm. And that calm held more strength than any confrontation ever could. And when I looked ahead, I didn't see her absence anymore. I saw my presence, steady and intentional, and that realization made me smile without effort. Because for the first time, the future wasn't something I hoped would happen to me. It was something I was already living, building and choosing every day, without asking permission or looking back for approval. And that felt like the real victory I never knew I was chasing. I didn't plan a closing scene, but closure found me anyway. One quiet evening when Sophia asked, "Do you ever think about how all of this started?" And I said, "With a loss I thought would end me." And she replied, And I smiled and said, "It gave me everything I stopped asking for." And we sat there without rushing the silence. And I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. Not toward Emily, not toward Ryan, not even toward myself. And when Sophia said, "You don't talk about her much now," I answered, "She doesn't live here anymore." And she nodded and said, "That's peace." And later Mark joked, "You really walked into that wedding and walked out reborn." And I laughed and said, "I walked in trying not to disappear." And he said, "And walked out?" And I replied, "Present." And Laura hugged me and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And I said, "I finally am too." And that mattered more than applause ever could. And one day Sophia asked, "If you could say one thing to her now, what would it be?" And I thought carefully before saying, "Nothing." And she smiled and said, "That's growth." And it was because silence no longer felt like avoidance, it felt like completion. And when memories surfaced, they arrived without pain. Just context, like old photos that no longer asked for emotion. And I understood then that I didn't need to hate Emily to move on. And I didn't need to thank her either, because gratitude and resentment are just different ways of staying attached. And I was done attaching my future to someone else's choice. And Sophia once asked, "Do you feel like you won?" And I answered, "I feel like I stopped losing myself." And she said, "That's a quieter victory." And I agreed, because nothing about this ending was loud or dramatic. There was no final confrontation, no speech, no apology that fixed everything. There was just a man who learned to stand still while the world rearranged itself around him. And when people said, "You handled that well," I replied, "I handled myself." And that distinction changed everything. And as time passed, the story others told about me stopped mattering. Because I was living one they couldn't see from the outside, built on ordinary mornings, honest conversations, and a calm that didn't flinch. And one night, Sophia rested her head on my chest and said, "You know you didn't arrive at that wedding to prove anything?" And I said, "I arrived to remind myself I existed." And she whispered, "And now?" And I said, "Now I don't need reminders." And that was the truth. Because losing everything stripped away the noise, the performance, the constant negotiation for love. And in that absence, I found something solid, something unshakable, something mine. And when I look back now, I don't see betrayal as the center of the story. I see transformation, slow and uncomfortable and necessary, and I understand the irony fully. That the moment I thought my life ended was the moment it actually began, not with a new bride at my side, but with a self I finally chose. And as I move forward, I don't carry resentment, I carry clarity, and that clarity keeps my steps light and my direction steady. And if there is a victory here, it isn't public. It isn't dramatic, it isn't loud, it's the quiet knowledge that I survived heartbreak without becoming bitter. That I rebuilt without needing revenge, and that I walked away not as the man who was left behind, but as the man who found himself, whole and unafraid. And that is how the story ends, not with closure given by someone else, but with closure I claimed, silently, permanently, and without ever needing to look back again.